So if you remember back to the first lecture in this chapter, I talked about the overall theme being how can we define fairness? Well, now that we've got a variety of voting systems to use as examples, we can start looking at some specific criteria that we'd like a fair system to have. So over the course of this lecture, we're going to talk about 4 different fairness criteria, and we're going to look at how some of those voting systems that we talked about in the previous lectures kind of do with respect to those rules. Several years ago, when I was teaching this material in a ground class, I had a student who was absolutely shocked at the idea that there could be a vote that wasn't determined by the majority criterion. So, and as we've seen, there are a lot of other ways to resolve an election, but on the other hand, she wasn't entirely off base in her thinking. Her understanding is embodied here in our first fairness criterion. The so-called majority criterion says that in the event that someone gets a majority of the vote, which, as we've seen, may not always happen, then that person should be the winner. Okay, so with that criterion in mind, the next question we'd like to ask is, how do our voting systems fare with respect to this? In other words, can we count on them to always satisfy this general rule? So, spoiler alert, but the answer to that is going to be no. So to see this in action, I don't want you to take my word for it. I have a voting situation here, ranked voting system, and I want to figure out the winner of this system based on the Borda method. Right now, I'm going to show you the results in a minute, but I've got them hidden just in case if you like to get some practice in. I've got the ranking and the point values over here on the right. You can pause the presentation, work this out on your own, right? Then start it back up, and you can compare your results to mine. Okay, so here's what I ended up with. Candidate A gets 64 points, candidate B gets 38, and candidate C gets 66. So, candidate C has the most points, so according to our Borda method, candidate C is the winner. But that's a problem. If you look back up at the first place rankings, candidate A got 18 out of 10 first place votes. If we're just looking at a majority situation, candidate A should have been the winner. So just right off the bat, you see here the majority criterion is not always going to be satisfied by the Borda method. And we've got a specific example here of that. But now we've got an issue. Are we going to be okay with that or not? That this is going to sometimes happen, because if you look at the votes, the method here really kind of did what we asked it to do. Candidate A is a bit of a polarizing candidate. They're highly liked by some people and highly disliked by other people. Or candidate C, on the other hand, there aren't a whole lot of people who put him as their first place choice, but he doesn't have anybody who really doesn't like him at all compared to everybody else, right? He has no third place votes. All of his votes are either in the first or second place category. So it is kind of doing what we wanted it to do, right? It's penalizing someone who is, as I said, in that kind of polarizing candidate position. So our second fairness criterion is called Condorcet's criterion. It's a person's name. It's named after a French mathematician, the Marquis de Condorcet. And it says that if a candidate can defeat every other candidate in a head-to-head vote, then they should win the election. In other words, if one candidate is preferred over everybody else individually, then that should be enough to get them the win. Okay, so let's take a look at another scenario with this one. So we take a look at these results. I want you to think about the plurality method. Based on that approach, candidate A is the winner. Right, candidate A has 20 first place votes versus 8 for B and 14 for C. Right, so that puts them in the lead. However, if you look at one-on-one voting versus candidate C, candidate A is preferred to candidate C by the people in those first two columns, those 20 first place votes. However, in the other two columns, candidate C is preferred to candidate A, and those two columns amount to 22 votes. So the plurality method, the bottom line here, the plurality method does not satisfy Condorcet's criterion because, as we see here, it is possible to have a situation where the plurality winner isn't preferred over every other candidate. So our next criterion is called the independence of irrelevant alternatives criterion. And in this case, irrelevant alternatives is kind of a polite way of saying the people who lost. So if you look at this statement here, if a candidate wins an election and some of the non-winners are removed, like we did with the plurality with elimination method, then the original winner should still win. In other words, if we remove people who didn't win the election, that shouldn't change the result. Okay, so again, let's look at another example here. So this is the same preference table that we saw in the previous example, using the plurality method. Again, with that approach, candidate A wins. They've got 20 votes versus 8 for B versus 14 for C. Okay, but what happens if candidate B drops out of the race? Right? In that case, the only column that's going to change is the third column, the 8-vote column, where everybody is going to shift up one to fill in that gap, and we get this. Now the situation has changed. Candidate C now has 22 votes to candidate A's 20, and candidate C becomes the winner. So the plurality method is an example of a voting system that does not satisfy that independence of irrelevant alternatives criterion. Because we've got one more fairness criterion here, right? It's what's called the monotonicity criterion. Monotonic, it's a bit of a technical word. A monotonic function is one that strictly increases, right? Never turns around and gets smaller. And you can kind of see that in the criterion here. It says if a candidate wins and there's a re-election and a set of voters change their mind, and if all of them change their mind to vote for the candidate who won, there's the monotonic part, right? His vote count, his point count, whatever method we're using, some went up, then he should still be the winner. So I've got a preference table here for us to look at, and we're going to apply the plurality with elimination method to it. Right, so if you'd like to pause, work through that on your own, right, this would be the place to do it. So the first thing I see here is candidate C is going to be first thing I see is that nobody has a majority. Right, so we are going to have to go through at least one round of eliminations. So I'm going to start by eliminating candidate C. They're at the low spot with 9 votes. So if we do that, the table becomes this. And A has 20 votes to B's 11. It gives them a majority. Candidate A is the winner. Okay, well, suppose there are situations where you kind of know how the votes are going to go, right? In votes in Congress, for example, there's a lot of conversations that take place before before something actually gets voted on. A lot of the time, everybody pretty much knows how it's going to go, right? So let's say you have that kind of situation here, and the people in that 3-vote group see that candidate A is going to win, and they say, okay, so you know what, we're gonna switch our vote, right? We can see you're going to win. We're going to vote you instead of candidate B. Well, if you do that, the table becomes like this. And now the situation has changed. Now candidate B is the one with the lowest number of votes. So on this first round of eliminations, they're the ones that are going to get eliminated. And this is where we end up. Okay, well now candidate C has 17 votes to candidate A's 14. So candidate C ends up being the winner, even though candidate A's first place votes increased. Okay, it's kind of at a high level here. What happened was when we took candidate B out of the first place row for just those 3 votes, that was enough to shift first place support to candidate C, right? Candidate C got moved into the second place position, and the dominoes fell from there. So fairness is kind of taking a bit of a beating here today, and unfortunately, the situation is actually even a little worse than it might have appeared so far. We have this thing; it's called Arrow's impossibility theorem, and what it says is, in any election involving more than two candidates, there is no voting method that will satisfy all of the four fairness criteria. So, unfortunately, a truly fair voting system based on these four rules simply doesn't exist, which leaves you in an awkward position if you're trying to set up an election. Essentially, you have to sit back and think, okay, well, what do I think is most important here? Or what sort of flaws am I willing to accept in the admittedly somewhat unusual circumstance where one of them actually happens? So at this point, we've covered quite a lot of material about kind of the voting systems that I think everybody is accustomed to, right? To seeing in political elections in particular. There are others. There's been kind of an implicit assumption in everything we've done here that one person gets one vote. And that whole one person, one vote thing, it's very much ingrained in our idea of democracy. But there are other systems. There are situations where people get more than one vote. Kind of a classic example is publicly traded companies. A very common method that's used when you start selling shares of stocks in your company is that it's not one person, one vote. It's one share of stock, one vote. So, for example, someone who has one share of stock gets one vote, where someone who owns 1,000 shares of stock gets 1,000 votes. So it's that kind of so-called weighted voting system that we're going to talk about in the next series of lectures.